My name is John Holden. I'm president of the Edgewater Historical Society. I'm glad to see a nice full house here for our first program of 2025. Without further ado, let me turn the floor over to Ed and give him a warm applause.
So, I am, as John mentioned, journalist, author, and data geek. I say that without a blush. And I find this stuff fascinating. And the fact that all of you people filled the house on a cold Saturday morning for a talk with the word demographic in the title makes me think you shared that enjoyment of it. You find it this is fascinating as I do. So I guess we'll find out. So with that, let's talk about the impact of COVID. I'm going to broaden it out a little bit after I talk about COVID, but we'll start with this. You probably know that Chicago grew during the 2010s, including the white flight, which had been occurring for 60 years, ended during that decade. But since the pandemic, the population has dropped. Now, if you go onto the internet and Google Chicago population, you will get the numbers that I quote here. And they come off the Census Bureau's website. And it would lead you to think that the population has dropped by 82,000 over 5 years, which is a lot. But if you've been doing this for as long as I have, the numbers are suspicious because this number is taken from the decennial census, which is done by actual count, in theory. And this is taken from the American Community Survey, which is a survey. And they don't count everybody, they count a sample. And there's built-in sampling errors. And so the results you get from those two different data sets are similar, but they are not the same. And they are often off by tens of thousands. So the fact that it says 82,000 there is not a reliable number. Why did the census do it that way? Because it's government work, I guess. But also because during COVID in 2000, they couldn't conduct the survey to their satisfaction. So they didn't have comparable data. So they came up with the number they've got, close enough. However, we're into the business of exact science here. So what I did was I went back and I compared the 2013 data with the 2019 data, which preceded COVID when they had a good survey. And there you see the results. The number, yeah. Let's get back. I'm a little fumbled there. The population did go down, but probably only by about 30,000, not 80,000. The number of Hispanics and Asians went up, whites and blacks went down. Is 30,000 a reliable number? I don't know, but it's more reliable than 82,000. Still, it went down. It didn't go up. That's not a good thing. Question is, who left? And how bad off are we for their loss? I happen to know, because I've done a lot of work with this stuff, that college graduates as a class were a huge driver of change in Chicago and have been over the last 40 years, and specifically since 2010. So I thought it would be a good idea to look specifically at college graduates and see how their numbers change. Because if educated people are leaving Chicago, that's a really bad sign. To my delight, I found out that wasn't the case. In fact, for all four of Chicago's major ethnic groups, Hispanics, non-Hispanic, whites, blacks, and Asians, the numbers of college graduates living in the city went up. In some cases, substantially. Now, these are the numbers here I'm showing you are for the 2010s. You can see the numbers went up. We gained, during the 2010s, we gained about 200,000 college graduates. Big number. Between 2019 and 2023, somewhat to my surprise, I found the same result. The number of college graduates for all 4 major ethnic groups increased. Not necessarily a lot. Non-Hispanic whites only went up 5,000. Chicago, during the 2010s, was a major destination for people who graduated from universities in the Midwest, Big Ten schools in particular. At one point, this shows you what a geek I am, I went to LinkedIn, and you can do a data search for where people went to college. And Chicago was the major destination for people on LinkedIn, hundreds of thousands of people who reported where they went to school, of every city in the country, including New York. Now, is that true now? Well, it's calmed down. There's only 5,000 additional college graduates who were white in that 4-year period. Nonetheless, this was COVID, and people continued to move in, which is pretty interesting all by itself. Also, even more interesting, the other 3 major ethnic groups, Hispanics, Blacks, and Asians, also reported big gains. 23,000 additional college graduates, Hispanic, 20,000, Black, 23,000, 22,000 Asians. Total increase, almost 90,000 during COVID, okay? People were bailing out of big cities. The number of college graduates increased. That's a striking fact. So who left? Well, if we know the people who got college degrees went up, the people without college degrees had to go down. And in fact, that's what happened. The number of, all 4 major ethnic groups saw declines. Now, admittedly, in Hispanics, it was a pre-trivial decline. But 40,000 whites, 36,000 blacks, 7,000 Asians left. Now, I'm not trying to be elitist about this. I'm not saying that people who don't get college degrees are unworthy individuals. I am sorry they left. I'm sorry we all had to go through COVID. However, the silver lining in this very dark cloud was the fact that the people who stayed were the most educated people, and their numbers increased substantially during one of the major crises of our lifetimes. It's a striking fact. The numbers, by the way, somebody here is probably going to add up the numbers and realize they don't fit. And I've got an excuse, and I wrote it up there because somebody was going to hammer me for it. It's because this doesn't report every single data group and every single age bracket. So, don't, off my case. So, the upshot was that Chicago, COVID, oddly enough, left Chicago better educated. It actually worked out okay. Is that bizarre or what? The number of college graduates as a percentage in Chicago as of 2023, the last year available, rose to 45.7%, which is the highest of the 7 largest U.S. cities by a considerable margin and pulling away. More even than New York. Now, lest we all start patting ourselves on the back. The 8th largest city, San Diego, has 52%, so we've still got a ways to go. But still, considering we live in what was at one time an old factory town, the fact that we have the number of college graduates taking, and it continues to rise even during times of crisis, is a remarkable fact. So, I want to move on from the immediate crisis, which we have survived remarkably well, at least as far as the demographic aspect of it is concerned, to some of the trends that we saw over the long span. And I've been here for a while, and I know what the long span is like, and I see a few gray hairs, and I know some of you have too. Some of those trends are, and I alluded to this, college graduates, the influx of college graduates has transformed this city in a multitude of ways, some just physical. The neighborhoods, a lot of the neighborhoods, I'm going to talk about that, have improved demonstrably. 400,000 additional college graduates from 2000 to 2023. Can you guys see this okay?
Yeah.
Okay. As I said, white flight ended, which had been going on since 1950. It ended in 2010. The number of white people increased in Chicago. Not a ton, but it did go up and not down. The reason it went up and not down is that the number of college graduates coming in exceeded, finally, the number of non-college graduates moving out. The city is more affluent, but an important point, it is still not a wealthy city by comparison to its suburbs. We have the median household income in Chicago is 83% of that for the metropolitan area as a whole. If you want to find the big money, they're out in the burbs. The Ken Griffins of the world are bailing as it is. So even though the city is more prosperous as it was, it belies the idea that we are a city of rich people and we can support any kind of financial burden that you might want to put on. It's wealthier than it was. It is still not wealthy. The black community has shrunk a lot, and it's continuing to shrink. It has declined. At one point in 1980, it was almost 1.2 million. Since then, it has declined by 440,000. And it wasn't just anybody. I did a lot of work on it. I have a whole different talk I can give you about the black community. The people who left overwhelmingly were middle class or went on to become middle class. And did they all move to Atlanta? Not necessarily all of them, but a lot of them moved to southern cities like Atlanta, Washington, D.C., which is actually a southernish city, Tucson, Houston, Dallas. The middle class, the black middle class in those towns rose dramatically. The one in Chicago flatlined. We are one of the few cities. Now, I went to the top 10 largest black metros in the country. Detroit and Chicago were at the end of the range. We were the outliers. The black middle class of both towns bailed. And why did they bail? Racism probably was part of it, but what, the South is not racist? That's why black people left the South in the first place. It was racist. Because of the loss of industrial jobs that have brought them here in the first place. The economy changed, and they followed the jobs and went back to the South. It's great if you got, Atlanta, Georgia now is, without a doubt, the capital of black America, and a lot of the people who made it that way came from Chicago. It's a great thing for Atlanta, it's not a good thing for us. The city, however, is slowly becoming, I'm not going to say integrated, that would overstate the case. It is becoming less segregated than it was, and it's about time. We'll see a little bit more about that later on. And then, finally, and this is something I want to come back to a lot here, for some, including, I think, many in this room, Chicago, or at least parts of Chicago, have become a city of choice. And what I mean by that is, you are here because you want to be here. You had a choice. A lot of you went to college. You could have gone a lot of different places. You decided to come here, and this is where you will put down your roots. And that makes you different from what was typically the case 100 years ago, where you went to Chicago because you were an immigrant, you needed a job, there was factory jobs in Chicago, and the housing was cheap. You were here not because you loved big cities, but because it was convenient. You were a citizen, you were a city dweller of necessity, not a city dweller of choice. And the change that we have seen is that now, for many people, at least in many parts of town, excuse me, Chicago is a city of choice. Not everybody, but for a selected group of people. Yeah. Okay, so we get now into the delicate and controversial subject of gentrification. Or, if I want to pick a somewhat highfalutin term, late-stage urbanism. You've probably heard of late-stage capitalism. Why can't we have late-stage? It sounds a little classy. Edgewater is a case in point. There is no question that gentrification, in the sense that it's often used as a bad thing that drives up property values and you can't afford to live there anymore, it happens. It doesn't always happen. And that's an important point that I'm going to come back to. The Edgewater, I would put forth to you, and you may argue with me about this, but from the numbers and from my experience of Edgewater, and I don't live in Edgewater, but I live close by and I'm up there quite a bit, it's a neighborhood of choice, in my observation. People live here because they want to live For whatever reason, maybe it's not necessarily a virtuous reason, maybe they just like the bar scene, but they want to live here, and they've had the option to move someplace else, and they made that choice. So here we get into Ed's theory of urban change, which I'm going to give you the simplified version, but this is a narrative that you don't find much in the academic literature for reasons that, frankly, are somewhat mysterious. And you may argue with me, and don't do it like this, but we can talk about that later. But there is a natural urban succession that occurs. It has been occurring for well over the entire history of Chicago. First, immigrants arrive, they settle in big cities like Chicago or New York or Philadelphia, whatever, because the jobs are there and the housing is cheap. Once they start making a few bucks, eventually, the classic thing, they move up and out. They move to, they're typically in the inner city back in the old days. They move to better housing on the fringes of city, and ultimately they wind up in the suburbs. And then a new generation of immigrants moves in behind them. And we have seen this repeatedly in my own lifetime. Probably, I'm sure you have too. In late stage urbanism, which I say with some embarrassment, but it's, I don't want to call it gentrification necessarily. A new variety of immigrant moves in, a well-educated immigrant, and they're not coming off the boat, but they're coming from someplace other than Chicago. They are immigrants in that sense. I did some calculation. It is probably the case that 90% of the college graduates living in Chicago now were not born within the city limits. I was born in Oak Park, Illinois. It was a mile and a half outside the city limits. Not a lot, but more than half were not even born in the state of Illinois. Something like 54%. A lot of them were born in the suburbs, downstate Illinois, wherever. But they had to make the choice. The 90% who had to move from someplace else moved to Chicago because they had a range of options, and Chicago looked the best of them. And they have stuck it out. And that has made Chicago a very different place than it was when I was a kid. So yeah, city dwellers by choice. The fact is, when they take surveys, Gallup does these every 10 years or so, they ask people where they would like to live. And the winner, invariably, is the suburbs of a big city. And some like the rural, and some like small towns, and yada, yada. And there's a non-trivial minority that like big cities. But the mainstream view is living in the suburbs is the best. You have the most room, you can get the kids can play in the backyard, yada, yada, all the things you've heard about. There is a smaller, non-trivial number, but a smaller number who like the big cities. Sometimes they just want to come there for the bar scene in their 20s, and sometimes, like me and I think many of you, they stick it out for their entire lives. The difference with this late stage crowd is that they're educated, typically, and they have more money. And so there's a change inherently in the process because of that. And there's a journalist called Aaron Hall, who's written a book about this called The Great Inversion, because people tend to, the inner city that formerly was synonymous with poverty and all the rest of the ills that we know about, is now the place that attracts people with a couple of bucks, and it's become the expensive part of town. It's completely changed the whole demographic look of big cities like Chicago. Not all cities experience this, but many do, and even some that were given up for lost, like Detroit, are starting to experience revitalization of their urban centers because some people just like it for whatever reason. The result is often gentrification, which I define as a sharp upturn in property values, but not always. And again, Edgewater is an example of that. So, I want to go through, this is some maps. Can you see these maps? Yeah. There's a lot of data crammed into it. I could spend hours, and I have, and boy, you better not be good for Thanksgiving dinner with me. So I won't try and point out everything, but basically we've got 3 metrics that I have looked at over the years, starting in 1980. The first is the percentage of college graduates, and blue tends to be a higher number, and red is a lower number. So college graduates, percentage of college graduates versus the U.S. average. The median household income, blue is more affluent, red is way less affluent. And home value. Home values are high when it's blue, and they're low when it's red. And you can see in 1980, Chicago was a declining industrial town, to be quite blunt about it. You look here, there was college graduates along the lakefront. You've got Hyde Park down here, you've got UIC, some on the fringe here, up on the north side and far south side, but that was really about it. Likewise, household income, the outlying parts of town where the immigrants of yore wound up before they bailed for the burbs, reasonably affluent, I wouldn't say wealthy, but they're reasonably affluent, north, south, southeast. A little bit on the lakefront, but not even that much there. Hyde Park, a little bit. Home values in the toilet, frankly. Again, not even on the south side at all. Really, a little tiny bit along the Gold Coast here, and then on the north side. That was the declining industrial town of 43 years ago. Things started moving up from there, but it was slow. You see here, we've got a few more college graduates. Along the lakefront, it's pushing west from the lakefront, but still not a lot. Same deal. Still pretty low income. Expanding a little bit. Lincoln Park, near north. But even near north, half of that was affluent. The other half was Cabrini, very impoverished area.
And I can't read that well from here. Is this online somewhere? I'm jumping ahead.
This is not online. If you can't read this, we can put the lights out altogether. Is that going to help?
Yeah, it's small.
This is a lot. I apologize. It's just kind of hard to avoid. So I'm going to try. We can go back and look at this. Let me get through the whole thing right now. We can go back. If there's anything of interest you want to see, look in greater detail. We can do that.
May I just say what those three titles are? What are those three?
This is percentage of college graduates versus the U.S. average. And if you've got color, that means you're ahead of the U.S. average. If you don't have any color, you're below the U.S. average. The household income, if you're blue, you're above the average for Cook County. And if you've got red, particularly dark red, you're way below the average for Cook County. For home value, blue is above the average for Cook County, and red is below. That's the basic concept used all the way through. There's other ways to do it, but this was something I could do over time. With me so far? Okay. Again, things improved a little bit. You can see now that the area where college graduates live, in fact, a lot of college graduates, has noticeably expanded. We're going back in a couple of miles from the lakefront now. So that was a big change. Household income. Income tends to be a lagging indicator. It's sort of a geeky term. What I mean by that is it isn't the first thing to develop. And the reason for that, I think, is that college graduates come during what I call the big sorting when they get out of school and they have to decide where they're going to live, where their first job is going to be, where they want to settle down. And when they do that, they have bright prospects, most of them, but they haven't making the big money yet. So they may show up and live out here in the neighborhoods, but they're not making the kind of big money that's going to show up here yet. So this is a lagging indicator. If it starts, this area starts to get big in one census, in the next one, this is probably going to get bigger too. Home value is a little bit of a wild card because I recall, because I was a homeowner back in the 90s, and to this day, property values shot up starting in the mid-90s for a variety of reasons I won't go into. It just became popular to live in the city. And you can see what it was looking like here as of 2000, and it continued until the crash of 2000. 2010. Now we're starting to really rock and roll. The college, the college town area is getting to be really huge and extending down to the South Lakefront. The South Lakefront historically has been an impoverished area that has lost tens of thousands of people and dwellings. There are vacant lots all over the place. But nonetheless, as of 2010, people were starting to move back. It hadn't amounted to anything too dramatic, but you can see the beginnings of it starting here. Now, Hyde Park was there, so they had that to begin with, but it was starting to happen. The income, remember what I said, 10 years previously in 2000, this whole area had a lot of college graduates moving into, and now 10 years later, they're making some money, and that shows up in the census. And as I say, the property values, particularly in the place where people with big money are, but even in sort of what had been the working class parts of the Northwest Side, were rising a lot. 2023, the most recent data we have. Now, the area where college graduates live by preference is a huge area. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this, but I don't want to spend too much time on it now. But it is a major factor in the economy of Chicago. The household income, likewise, is remarkably high, a huge area. This comes in as far as Western Avenue, Kedzie, Pulaski, places that were, they were in pretty bad shape when I was a kid. And now, there's obviously a difference between what it looks like in Lincoln Park and what it looks like out in Avondale. But they are all on the uptake and see a major and sustained intake of college graduates over time. And property values are high all the way down here to 47. 47. Now, I'll pause here to note that is gentrification occurring? You bet. You can't really see this well, but the black squares here, the census tracts, the little data units that they use, are 200% of the county average. You can argue about and I look at gentrification as primarily a complaint about it's too expensive to live here anymore. So my marker for gentrification is the property values. There's other things you could look at, I understand that, but it's simple to do it this way.
Can I just note, can you say anything about it? Looks like the pocket on the median home value up around Edgewater is actually much lower.
You notice, yeah, I'm going to come back to that. I thought somebody might pick up on that. Yes, and that's why Chicago is a great example of what I'm talking about. A neighborhood of choice. People, there are obviously some beautiful homes in Edgewater. There are some expensive sections. They're not as crazy expensive as Lincoln Park by a long shot. But nonetheless, on the whole, property values in Edgewater and also in Rogers Park and West Rogers Park and West Reserve are really not that high. And in some cases, they're actually kind of low. Nonetheless, they have a high percentage of college graduates. People aren't living in Edgewater, I don't think, maybe you'll tell me differently, or Rogers Park, because they're surrounded by their fellow rich people. They just like it there. Why do they like it? God only knows. I find Edgewater charming. I just like to walk around. I think it's a cool neighborhood. There's all kinds of interesting streets. Got interesting little stores. I go to the Gethsemane Garden Center, yada yada. You name it. They have
the Edgewater Historical Society?
The Edgewater, that's Andersonville. There's a lot of cool stuff. And the Edgewater, there's cool people. You meet people you don't meet in the suburbs. That's the excuse that I give. So, I'm going to come back to this. But you can see this is where we are today, and it's a continuing process. Where are we going to be in 2030, 2040? No idea. But if things continue at this rate, Chicago will be a dramatically different place. One of the things I point out was that if Chicago is now getting close to 46% college graduates, within this decade, if it keeps up at this rate, it is almost certain that it will be more than half college graduates before 2030 arrives. Something magic happened? No, but that's a pretty striking change considering what Chicago started out as 40, 50 years ago. So, you're looking at that, and let's go back and take a look at it. So, we've got a lot of college graduates here, that looks great. Well, what about the rest of this? Not so much. A little bit, and here we have, you know, Beverly. Beverly and Morgan Park, which have been stable for a long time, but in the middle, not so much. Likewise, the income is low and the property value is low. So, does that mean the expression you've heard, Chicago, great, it's doing great someplace, but it's 1/3 New York and 2/3 Detroit. I know the guy who originated that expression, by the way. Nice guy. My answer is not really. You often hear it said that Chicago has lost its middle class, not just in the black community, which is certainly the case, but in general. If you look at the numbers, it is the case that the middle class in Chicago has shrunk somewhat, but it still remains a pretty dominant part of the scene. In 2000, 1% of Chicagoans were high income, 69% middle income, 30% low, which is, you know, the ideal. In other ways to look at this, the Brookings Institution says it ought to be 20 high, 60 middle, and 20 low. So 69 middle is pretty good. Now, if that has shrunk somewhat in 2020, 63% were middle income, 32 low, so that had gone, and 6% high income. So the extremes have gained, but it has not made a dramatic change. It is not the case that the middle class of all ethnic groups has bailed out Chicago. It's just not true. It is, however, and this is an important point, Chicago is wealthier than it was. It is not wealthy by comparison to its suburbs. 83%, median household income in the city of Chicago is only 83% of the metro area. You want to get the big bucks, you still got to go up to the North Shore. It is the case, however, that much of the city has shifted from lower middle class to upper middle class. And how you define those things is a question for for some discussion. Nonetheless, people are making a pretty good buck. And there are the 6% of billionaires. I'm not a medical. But on the whole, people are doing way better than they were. It is still not a rich city in the sense that people think they understand that term. So, let's talk a little bit about what has driven all of this change. And really it has been college graduates who have made this area here, and what I'm going to call, I wouldn't call it the gentrified part of Chicago because not all of it, including Edgewater, is an expensive place to buy or rent a home. It is, however, a place where the college graduates are a very large percentage of the people who live there. And this area here, I'm going to say this makes up what I'm calling neighborhoods of choice. And what I mean by that is people live there because they want to. And why do they want to? It varies. And like I said, maybe they like the bar scene, maybe they like the fact that they get to come to the Historical Society and listen to talks about it or something. But for whatever reason, they're there and they stay there. It used to be the case, people would say, well, they show up in their 20s and they go to bars and they get drunk and then they get married and go to the... And some of them do that, but not all. It's increasingly the case, and you can see this in the school data and all the rest of the stuff, which I'm not going to show you. A lot of them stick it out for the long haul. They tend to cluster. This is not a random collection here. It isn't scattered all over the place. It's largely a contiguous area. It's a characteristic of this. And why are they there? Because of amenities. The original amenity in Chicago, obviously, is the lake. The fact that the lake has been there all this time in some of the fanciest housing is itself an amenity. Some of the classiest housing, an example here is, this is Beverly Morgan Park, built around the Blue Island Moraine, which is a bunch of hills. It's a pretty area, and it's got some very nice housing. And that, I would put forth to you, is the reason that the area has stayed as prosperous as it has for as long as it has. It's got nice housing in a pretty area. It's an amenity. The fact that people have moved in and patronize a nice collection of restaurants and all is itself an amenity. And that, I think, is the main reason that the area grows continuously. You can't afford to live in Lincoln Park, so you move to the part of the area that you can live. And I did that myself. We priced out Lincoln Park when we were looking at houses, and they were crazy money. We moved up to Lakeview, which was, I'm technically in Lakeview, believe it or not, what we call it Lakeview. It was way cheaper. We had to buy an old dump, fix it up. It has improved around me, but that's why this area has spread the way it has. That's a characteristic. These all, I would say, are people, like I said, they are neighborhoods of choice. People want to live there. It accounts for, and this gets to the point that I'm trying to make, only 35% of the land area, but more than half of the population of the entire city. It is substantially denser. 16,000 residents per square mile, 9,000 for the rest.
Edgewater is 50,000 per square miles. Edgewater is 50,000 per square.
There you go. It varies quite a bit. I mean, downtown, the New North Side is a lot higher. It is also, and this gets to an important point that I think Edgewater is a good example of. It is demographically stable. It is diverse, at least by Chicago standards, which ain't saying a lot. I understand that, but it is sometimes, but not always, wealthy. So I want to go through this quick. This is the same data set on the far left here. I just want to be able to compare them to the other two things which are new. I think is helpful. So we've got, this is the college thing. We've seen this before. Here we've got, and this I apologize, this is kind of hard to read at this scale in the lighting we have. This shows the racial and ethnic distribution. The darker colors are, the darker the color, the more segregated it is. Dark green is more than 90% white. In 1980, that was a big chunk of the northwest side, big chunk of the southwest side. 90% blue here, dark blue means 90% black. Big chunk of the west side, really big chunk of the south side. Sharp division between the two, particularly striking on the south side. Western Avenue, as in 1980, you probably heard about the shifting of that boundary over time, was Western Avenue. The east side of Western Avenue, 90% black. The west side, 90% white. And the numbers would change in 10 years. I'm somebody who lived in the west side growing up. I live in Austin. A little over 10 years, my neighborhood went from probably 95, 98% white to more than 90% black. Very rapid turnover. That was still occurring down here. Median household income, now I divided it, it's the same basic number for income, but I divided it a different way. Now, dark blue means it's 200% of the county average. Blue, which is, it's pretty wealthy. Blue means it's above, it's in the middle income range. I have to get a little geeky here. One of the ways, it isn't the only way, but one of the ways to define middle class income now is 2/3 up to double the median income for the county. Now that's a little geeky, but what that means in the case of Chicago, I figured it out the other day, is something like $56,000 to $177,000 annually. And if you make it $177,000, you're doing pretty good. And you're doing better than somebody at the low end of the range, but you're still, by any reasonable understanding of the term, you're from lower middle class at one end to upper middle class at the other end, you're not really rich. If you're making $500,000, you're rich, you might be. So that's how they define it. You think it's a pretty broad range, but it's a pretty reasonable range when you think about it. And that's what we see here. If you're in the yellow, that's the area that is below that 2/3 cutoff. And that's the low-income area. And if you're in the black, of which there was none in 1980 in Chicago, that's the upper income area. I'll go through this quickly. It changes over time. Here, as you can see, the college gets more. The degree of segregation in Chicago gradually subsides. You notice it most strikingly, in the north side, northwest side, which gradually is down to the upper 75, which was still a lot. Not so much in the black community, which remained largely segregated until surprisingly late in the day. Maybe not so surprising. Meanwhile, there's the demographics, the middle income area. That's the center of the city, the urban inner city as of 1990 was still pretty much low income. 2000, that begins to change. Now you see in the center of the city, what used to be the inner city, the near west side, for example, it's starting to become part of the middle income area. The degree of segregation in the white community is noticeably diminished. A little bit, not so much in the black community. In fact, it's starting to expand into what the area that formerly was solidly white is now mixed income. And that in Chicago, as you know, means the short period from when the first white person moves out to when the last white person moves out. I like to take this in the truth. That's probably what was going on on the south side of the country. 2010, again, the trend continues. A lot more college graduates. Now, here's where I want to start taking a look at Edgewater specifically. Edgewater and Rogers Park and West Christmas. If it's yellow, you can see there's yellow here. That is no ethnic group predominates. No ethnic group has more than 50% of the people who live there. And that's often a temporary condition while a neighborhood transitions from all of one thing to all of something else, but not on the north side. This condition persists over long periods of time. Hold the question till I'm almost done with my what I want to say. And I think that has been a characteristic of neighborhoods of choice in general. I'm not saying they're all integrated. Lincoln Park here, although they have become more so. Lincoln Park is more than 70%, 75% white. There are no parts of it left that are 90%, and the parts that are 75% white are declining. It is becoming, I'm not saying it's the promised land, I'm saying it's becoming more integrated than it's was. Likewise, household income is spreading the north side in general and much of the near west side, pretty affluent. Still a lot of poverty, low income area in the, let's be blunt here, black neighborhoods on the west side and also on the south side. 2023 is today, as you can see, like I say, massive increases in the size of the popular part of town where a lot of college graduates live. The thing I'm going to point out the most, however, is two things. One is that the ethnic mix in the north side, far north side, has been pretty stable. There have been dramatic changes elsewhere. On the west side, Hispanics are displacing black people on the west side. On the southwest side, Hispanics are replacing white people. You see dramatic changes over a period of only 10 years. You don't see that in neighborhoods of choice. People don't vote. It's much more resilient. There are no doubt challenges. There's crime, as you know, in Rogers Park. But it doesn't make people panic and want to move out on the next bus. They stick it out. People have been worried about Rogers Park my entire life. Rogers Park has been surprisingly stable that entire time. Likewise, Edgewater, you probably got a few stories, but it has been remarkably stable. There has been no huge demographic shifts noticeable, unlike many other parts of the city that are not choice neighborhoods. And that is the big distinction to draw. You have choice neighborhoods which tend to be characterized by a lot of college graduates, but not all. I mean, if it's 45% that have 55% don't. A lot of people who don't like to live in the big city, but they are a marker, and they are a reliable marker. And once they become neighborhoods of choice, the evidence so far is that they stay there for a long time. So what do we deduce from all this? So now, I know you guys, it's been a long time. Sorry it's taking so long. First of all, we got through COVID on the whole just fine. Which it didn't happen, but you know what? It turned out okay for us. The south side, I mentioned this, the South Lakefront is starting to come back. I didn't take time to point it out because we were getting running so long here. But in the 2010s, you see the beginnings noticeably of a substantial increase in population, in housing construction, lesser extent in income, but it's clearly a neighborhood, an area which stretches from the South Loop all the way down to the South Shore, which was in really, really bad shape. Massive losses. You know, more than anywhere else in the city, entire vacant lots, entire blocks were vacant lots. It is coming back, you know, tens of thousands of dwellings were constructed. That's on the way down. The interior neighborhoods, the rest of the south side, not so good. The black middle class continues to pay, and that's a big continuing problem. On the north side, prices are getting pretty catastrophic, and that's eventually going to be a problem even in Edgewater. And I'm sure there are some neighborhoods like in Andersonville, which are pretty pricey right now. But it's going to continue to be a challenge. Nonetheless, there is still the potential that there is still room for the city to grow in terms of finding a place. If you want to live in the city and you might have to buy a fixer-up or something like that, you still have the opportunity to do that. Edgewater is starting to get to the point where it's getting pretty expensive, I understand that. But there is, and it's going to be something that as time goes on, development is going to push farther north because people are going to get priced out of the neighborhoods farther south. And that's going to be something that we're going to have to deal with affordable housing. Discussion for another day. Now, the good side about this, and I think the main takeaway here is despite the problems we have, Chicago is way more resilient than it was 50 years ago. And I mean that in a very basic way. People don't cut and run the first time they get itchy about something is going wrong. A black person moved in 5 miles away from me. Oh my God, there goes the neighborhood. I gotta move out now. That was kind of the attitude. In the neighborhood, my experience, I mean, my parents moved on up because Oak Park, where they moved like almost a lot of my years, was a nicer neighborhood. You know, we got a bigger house, bigger yard, yada yada. Nonetheless, they weren't rooted where they weren't in the west side of Chicago because that's really where they wanted to be. It was just a cheap housing. There was a train line going down, yada yada. Now people are here and have made the choice, and they're going to do. I mean, there's a limit beyond which they won't go, I'm sure. But they will do what they need to do to keep the neighborhood going. They will try to solve the problem. Rogers Park is an excellent example of that. The city is more affluent. It's still not wealthy. And we need to keep those college grads coming. Because they're what's driving the change. And I am 100% sure they're going to continue to be the main driver of change. So, well.